In this lesson, we'll talk about the New Deal. Make sure you're on page 5 of your interactive notebook. In 1932, there was an election. Herbert Hoover was up for re-election as the incumbent Republican candidate, and Franklin D. Roosevelt was the Democratic nominee. Hoover, in response to the Great Depression, by 1932, we had been about 3.5 years into the Depression. By the time he's up for re-election, he strongly did not support federal public assistance. He believed it would destroy people's self-respect, the idea of working hard, the idea of working for oneself, and it would also create a large bureaucracy. Big word there, a bureaucracy is basically a system of government where all of the decisions are made by state or local officials rather than your elected representatives. So he didn't want that to happen. Public opinion isn't the best for Herbert Hoover at the time because it does seem like he's not helping out the common man. Feels like he's just like, all right, do it on your own. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But what also didn't help him with this election is that he, one of the things, he disbanded a protest of World War I veterans. There was about 20,000 of them protesting. They're unemployed. They become known as the Bonus Army. And the fact that he went up against or disbanded a group of people who had just fought, or not too long ago, had fought in a world war, didn't look too good for him. So Franklin Roosevelt, who comes in, he was the former governor of New York. He promises, his campaign slogan is a new deal for the American people. That's what it becomes known as. And he, goes around campaigning with that. And he is very different from Herbert Hoover. He does want to experiment with some of the government roles. He wants to play around with things. He wants to have more government interaction in order to help combat the Great Depression. So some of the ideas, if we compare the two candidates, Roosevelt believed that the government has a responsibility to help people in need. And also, as we go through these, remember, Roosevelt is the Democratic candidate, and these are kind of similar ideas that the Democratic Party aligns with. Hoover was the Republican candidate, and these are some of the platforms of the Republican Party. Roosevelt also campaigns that he wants to have more control on big business. He wants to help Americans reassess how they're going to make it on their own without help. So he doesn't want the government to come in and take over everything, but he does want Americans to also kind of work for themselves as well, with some government assistance. A lot of Roosevelt's support is coming from your common workers. Those who are working in the cities, your coal miners, your immigrants, a lot of the families that are looking for federal relief. On the other hand, Hoover, he really believed that the federal government was not responsible for helping to fix or trying to fix people's problems. He argued that federal aid and government policies that aim to help the poor would alter the foundation of our national life. The idea that the government is stepping in, having much more power than it had had previously, he really felt that that was not a good idea. He also argued that in order to combat some of the problems of the Great Depression, to help people out, those who were struggling the most, he really wanted voluntary aid. He didn't want to create federal programs to go in and provide relief. He felt like groups like, say, the Red Cross or a local church, things like that, to help with the poor, as opposed to the national government stepping in. Hoover didn't really travel around and campaign very much during this campaign season. Roosevelt did go around. Roosevelt was seen. And anywhere that Hoover did go, he was heckled by the crowds. People were not happy with him at this time period. It looks on paper, it looks bad that Hoover, this is the way he felt, but he really did see that possibly putting too much emphasis on the government could cause problems. These programs have to be paid for, so it could cause Deficit spending. It caused the United States to go even more into debt. But unfortunately, when people are, homeless, jobless, and going into almost 4 years of it, it didn't look too good for Hoover. This is the Electoral College map for the election of 1932, red representing the Republicans or Hoover, blue representing the Democrats and Roosevelt. So as you can see, he did win in a landslide. The only states that didn't vote for him, or the only Electoral College states that didn't vote for him, I should say, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. So very effective campaign for Roosevelt here. So when he comes into office, any president that comes in, the first 100 days are always strongly looked at. Are they going to put their money where their mouth was? Are they going to fulfill those campaign promises? And Roosevelt really tries to do that. He knew coming into office that he needs to restore a sense of hope. The American public is panicked. They're worried. They don't know what to do. He needs to restore that sense of help. He needs to build confidence, basically. And he is very strategic in this all throughout his presidency. He utilizes what's known as a fireside chat, where he goes on and talks directly to the American public via the radio. The radio in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, before the TV is invented, was basically the TV of the day. Families would gather in the evening. They would listen to the radio, different programs. And once Roosevelt becomes president and does these fireside chats, people are glued to the radio to see what the president is going to talk about that night. So he was very strong with that. So as we said, he's going to provide Americans with a New Deal. And these New Deal programs he comes up with, they're aimed at three different areas: relief, recovery, and reform. So during those first 100 days, he pushes a lot of programs through with the help of Congress. So he is he is just up on the ground and running, just getting these things through Congress as quick and as possible as he can. And again, he's trying to provide relief to those who need it, create jobs, stimulate the economy, just kind of push us through this Great Depression and change it around. Some of the New Deal problems, they become programs, just to say. Again, like we said, they are aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. And what does that quite mean? Relief. Relief is going to give direct aid to those who need it, and reduce the suffering of those who are, unemployed, who are poor, the farming community, things like that. Recovery is going to create jobs. It's going to help businesses, and it's also going to try and restart the flow of consumer demand, get people purchasing things again, because that's going to help stimulate the economy. It's going to put up production. It's going to get the economy flowing again. And then lastly, reform. These are going to be permanent programs that are put in that help to avoid this type of disaster again. It's going to ensure citizens against this kind of disaster. It's going to avoid another depression in the future. Some examples of these programs, if you notice in the top left corner, I have a bowl of alphabet soup there. These programs, they get nicknamed, or catchphrase. They call them the alphabet soup programs, because all of these programs have acronyms. As you can see in my soup there, I've got FERA, I've got the TVA, I've got the SSA, the WPA, the FDIC, the AAA, the CCC, the NRA, the PWA, FHA, SEC. All of these programs have these acronyms. So they kind of, as a comical joke, they call them alphabet soup. But an example of a relief program would be the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA. This is not to be confused with the AAA that you would call, if your car broke down. Different AAA. But this one is going to provide relief to some of those farmers out in the Midwest who are suffering from the Dust Bowl, from low prices, things like that. An example of a recovery program would be the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. This was meant to stimulate the construction industry. They provided small loans to different families or different people in order to stimulate construction of homes. This is actually still around today. You can get an FHA loan. I actually had one on my first house. And then a reform example would be the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. This is another program that is still around to this day. If you've ever been to a bank, when you walk into the door, usually when you walk into the bank, not walk into the door, if you look on like where they list like their hour or something like that on the front of the building, usually you can see a little sticker on the window or something. You can see it says FDIC because this is still around. The FDIC basically insured bank deposits up against bank failure, up to a certain level. I think today they insure it up to $10,000. I could be wrong on that one though. But the idea here was, when everyone raced to sell their stocks on Black Tuesday, the banks couldn't cover the costs. They had loaned out money because that's what banks do. That's how a bank makes money. They loan out the money, they charge interest on it, and they make money that way. Unfortunately, when everyone came to collect their money on the same day, they didn't have it. And so the FDIC, and the banks, then they closed up. And all those people, they lost their money. They lost their life savings. So the FDIC came in and said they're going to insure that. So if you had money in the bank, the government's going to give you your money back. So this is trying to reform the banking industry. So those are just 3 examples. There's all kinds of different New Deal programs. So as we move into the mid-1930s, there is some criticism, as we'll talk about in the next slide, about these New Deal programs. But to just get a sense of how people felt about Roosevelt, the majority of Americans, he does go up for re-election in 1936. So this is our 1932 electoral map. Let's fast forward to 1936. And this is what it looks like there when he runs for re-election again against the Republican candidate Landon here. So even more blue than before. The only 2 states he doesn't take are Vermont and Maine. So again, a landslide victory for Roosevelt, and it kind of shows that the American public is on board with what he is doing during this time period. So as I said, there were some critics about the first New Deal. It becomes known as the first New Deal because he creates a second New Deal. But the programs that he pushes through Congress and gets approved, they don't have a significant impact. And so people start to criticize him. They start to attack the programs. A lot of people who were opposed to him say that this is creating too much federal government power, and they don't like that. So they're warning that these agencies, they might need to back off a little bit. FDR's administration says, look, we're going to create even more legislation. We're going to create more programs. We are trying to kick this depression in the butt. So they come up with what becomes known as the second New Deal. They have more social welfare benefits. They have more control over businesses, stronger support for unions. They tax more on the rich. An example of a second New Deal agency would be one that attacks unemployment, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. This program got 8 million people working, and some of the jobs they would do, they either built new or improved playgrounds, schools, hospitals, airfields. And it also supported writers and artists in that community, because a lot of times they were not supported. So again, you've been watching, we've been talking about the New Deal. You want to make sure to enter this into your interactive notebook. Ultimately, the New Deal does have successes and failures, but it does not, most historians argue, does not get us out of the Depression. It helps, but it isn't the cure-all. What we'll talk about in the next lesson, our entry into World War II. That's what ultimately does get us out of the Depression. But we will be talking in our next lesson about what led up to the entry of World War II. So thanks again for watching.